whose hobby is dating. What's your worst story? Story 1. I used to casually date a lot, but one experience still haunts me. I met this woman on a dating app, and we hit it off instantly. She was beautiful, funny, and seemed normal until our third date. We were having dinner at a nice restaurant when she started talking about soulmates. Harmless, right? Until she pulled out a notebook and started flipping through pages filled with astrological charts, compatibility scores, and a detailed breakdown of my birth chart. She had somehow found my exact time and place of birth, which I had never given her. She told me we were meant to be together, and if I broke the cosmic bond, my life would spiral into misfortune. I nervously laughed it off, but she suddenly grabbed my wrist and said, "I'm serious. You don't want to upset the universe." I paid the bill and made up an excuse to leave. When I got home, I blocked her on everything. The next morning, I found a note taped to my, "You have made a grave mistake." That was enough dating for a while. Story 2. I once matched with a girl who seemed sweet, but she had one quirk. She was obsessed with her dog. And I don't mean in a normal, I love my pet way. She brought her dog to the restaurant, gave it a seat at the table, and ordered it a steak. I thought she was joking, but nope. When the food arrived, she cut up the steak and hand-fed her dog while talking to it like a toddler. I tried to keep the conversation going, but every time I spoke, she'd interrupt me with, "Oh, look at Mr. Snuffles' face." After dinner, she invited me to her place. I was hesitant, but I figured why not? Maybe she was just nervous. Nope. Her apartment was a dog shrine. There were framed portraits of Mr. Snuffles everywhere, a custom-built dog bed that looked more expensive than my car, a literal altar with candles and dog treats. Then she said, "He sleeps in the bed with me. I hope that's okay." I noped out of there so fast I left my jacket. She messaged me later saying Mr. Snuffles didn't approve of me anyway. Story 3. I had a date with a woman who seemed completely normal online. We met up for coffee, and within 5 minutes, she asked me how much money I made. I laughed it off, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She followed up with, "Well, do you at least own a house? A car? Any investments?" I told her I was doing fine financially, but I didn't feel like discussing my personal finances on a first date. She scoffed and said, "I just need to make sure you can provide." Then she pulled out a list, an actual list. She started reading off her requirements for a man. Minimum 6 feet tall. I'm 5'11", which she said was barely acceptable. Must make at least 6 figures. Must be okay with her being a stay-at-home girlfriend. Must pay for her shopping, vacations, and nails weekly. I told her I didn't think we were compatible, and she lost it. She accused me of being broke and wasting her time. I just stood up and left. She texted me later saying, "I hope you find a woman willing to settle for mediocrity." I guess I dodged a bullet. Story 4. I once dated a woman who was into conspiracy theory. I don't mean she liked the occasional alien documentary. I mean she believed everything. On our first date, she casually mentioned that the moon landing was fake. I chuckled, thinking she was messing with me, but her face was dead serious. I let it slide. On our second date, she told me she didn't believe in airplanes. Airplanes. She said they were actually holograms created by the government to make us believe in modern technology. I asked her how she explained people flying on planes. Her response? Actors. On our third date, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Have you ever noticed how birds don't act normal? It's because they're government drones." I couldn't do it anymore. I told her it wasn't going to work out, and she called me a brainwashed sheep before storming off. Story 5. I met this woman at a bar, and we hit it off immediately. She was charismatic, funny, and full of energy. She suggested going back to her place, and I wasn't going to say no. The moment we walked in, she locked the door behind us and took my phone. I froze. She smiled and said, "Oh, I just don't like distractions." Then she led me to her living, where 6 other guys were sitting on her couch. I thought I had walked into a cult meeting. They all looked awkward, shifting in their seats. She sat down and said, "Okay, let's get started." One guy turned to me and whispered, "Run." I didn't even ask questions. I just grabbed my phone and sprinted out of there. She texted me later saying I failed the loyalty test. I still have no idea what I escaped from. Story 6. I went on a date with a woman who seemed really into me. Almost too much considering we had just met. She laughed at everything I said, kept touching my arm, and even mentioned that she had already told her mom about me. Weird, but okay. Then, halfway through dinner, she excused herself to the restroom. When she came back, she had changed her outfit. She sat down and acted like nothing was unusual. I was too stunned to say anything at first, but eventually I asked, did you just change clothes?" She smiled and said, "Yeah, the first outfit wasn't working. This one matches your energy better." I had no idea how to respond. Then she started talking about our future kids. Not if we had kids, but when. She had names picked out. She had even looked up schools in my area. At this point, I was actively looking for the waiter to bring the check. When it arrived, she grabbed it before I could, put down her card and said, "You can get the next one. Couples should take turns paying." I never said there would be a next. I blocked her number the second I got home. Story 7. I met a woman who seemed cool, but she had a weird rule. No photos. No selfies, no snaps of food, nothing. I figured she was just really private, until she told me the real reason. She leaned in close and whispered, "I don't want the government to track my movements." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She started explaining how cameras steal our souls, and how smartphones are portals for mind. Okay, a little odd, but maybe she was just eccentric. Then, as we were walking down the street, she suddenly pulled me into an alley and pressed me against the wall. She pointed up at a streetlight and said, "See that? That's not a light. That's a listening device. Don't talk when you're near them." At this point, I was convinced I was on a hidden camera prank show. I made up an excuse about needing to check on my dog, I don't have a dog, and left. She texted me later, "I hope you didn't say too much under the streetlights. Be safe." I changed my usual walking routes for a while after that. Story 8. I matched with a woman who had one request before we met. I had to bring a gift. She said it was a tradition for her first dates, and it didn't have to be big, just something sentimental. I was curious, so I brought a small book I thought she'd like. When I gave it to her, she lit up and said, "Oh, I love this. Let me show you my collection." She took out her phone and scrolled through hundreds of pictures of gifts from past dates. Jewelry, stuffed animals, handwritten notes, even a guitar. She proudly said, "I never go on a second date, but I love seeing what people bring me." I realized this woman had turned dating into a free souvenir service. I left shortly after, and yes, she kept the book. Story 9. I went on a dinner date with a woman who seemed great at first. Halfway through our meal, she excused herself to the bathroom. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I started wondering if she had ditched me. Then, the waiter came over and handed me a note. It said, "Sorry, I had to leave. You seemed nice, but I got bored. Enjoy dinner." She literally ghosted me with a note. I was shocked but laughed it off, finished my meal, and went home. A few days later, she messaged me saying, "Hey, I feel like we really clicked. Want to go out again?" I ignored it. She followed up with, "I don't like being ignored. It's really rude." The audacity. Story 10. I once dated a woman who was really into true crime. Like, obsessively into it. That alone wasn't a red flag until she started taking notes. During dinner, she kept steering the conversation toward how criminals think. Then she pulled out a notebook and started writing things down. At first, I thought she was a writer. I asked what she was doing and she said, "Just documenting your reactions." I laughed nervously and asked why. She replied, "It's important to know how different people respond to certain topics." I asked if she did this on all her dates and she said, "Only the interesting ones." After dinner, she asked if I wanted to take a walk in a secluded area. I politely declined, went home, and blocked her. No way I was becoming the subject of her next case study. Story 11. I met a woman who seemed perfect. She was funny, gorgeous, and had great conversation skills. We went on 3 dates, and everything was going well. Then, she invited me to her place for dinner. Her apartment was spotless, almost too spotless. No personal decorations, no family photos, and the bookshelves were filled with self-help books about controlling emotions and psychological manipulation. A little odd, but whatever. As we ate, she started talking about her hobby. She told me she loves making men fall in love with her and then ghosting them. She called it an experiment in human attachment. I nervously laughed and asked if she was joking. She wasn't. She told me about multiple guys she had lured in, made them think she was the one, then completely disappeared just to see how they reacted. Some begged, some got angry, some sent long-winded messages about how she ruined them. She kept all their texts in a folder on her phone like trophies. Then she looked at me and smiled. "You're next." I played it cool, finished dinner, thanked her for the meal, and never contacted her again. Weeks later, I got a single text from her. "You were no fun. Dodged a bullet there." Story 12. I once matched with a woman who seemed really into me. Like, really into me. She sent long messages, asked deep questions, and was practically planning our future within a few days. I figured she was just enthusiastic, so I agreed to meet up. On the date, things were intense from the start. She told me I gave off husband energy, and that she was looking for someone ready for real commitment. Then she casually mentioned she had already told her parents about me. I tried to keep things light, but she was locked in. She started telling me about her last relationship, how she moved in with her ex after 2 weeks and tested his loyalty by disappearing for a few days to see if he'd cheat. Then she asked, "Would you be okay if I quit my job and became financially dependent on you?" I tried to be polite, but she must have sensed my hesitation. She grabbed my hand and whispered, "Don't fight it. We were meant to find each other." The date ended, and I told her I didn't think we were a match. That's when the messages started. She texted me 50 plus times in a single night. Then she emailed me. Then she messaged me on LinkedIn. A week later, she showed up at my gym. I never told her where I worked out. I had to block her on everything and ask the gym to not let her in. A few months later, a mutual friend told me she had a new husband target. I hope he got out quicker than I did. Story 13. I once went on a date with a woman who insisted we go somewhere adventurous. I suggested an escape room or an amusement park. She suggested breaking into an abandoned building. I thought she was kidding. She wasn't. She showed up in all black, handed me a flashlight, and said, "Let's make this night unforgettable." I should have walked away, but curiosity got the best of me. We ended up sneaking into an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. She was way too good at this. Knew exactly where to climb, where the security cameras were, and how to move without making a sound. I asked her if she'd done this before. She grinned and said, "Oh, all the time. I love pushing limits. Last time we had to run from the cops." We wandered around inside for a while, but then she grabbed my hand and said, "Someone's here." I froze. She pointed toward a shadow moving in the distance. I was done. I whispered, "We need to leave." Her response? "Not yet. This is the best part." She pulled out her phone and started recording. I wasn't waiting around to find out what happened next. I turned and ran. She actually got mad at me for ruining the fun and refused to get in my car when I tried to drive us out of there. I left her behind. She later texted me, "You're too boring for me. Good luck dating normal girls." I'm fine with boring. Story 14. I met a woman at a party who was too charming. She had the kind of confidence that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. We started dating, and for the first month, everything was perfect. Then, weird things started happening. She would randomly disappear for days without explanation. When I asked, she'd say, "Oh, just taking care of things." She always paid for everything in cash. She never had social media. When I jokingly asked if she was in witness protection, she gave me a long stare and said, "Would that be a deal breaker?" One night, we were at a bar, and she excused herself to take a call. When she came back, she said, "We need to leave. Now." I asked why. She just grabbed my arm and pulled me outside. The second we stepped out, she started walking fast down the street. I kept asking what was going on, but she wouldn't answer. Then, she turned to me and said, "Listen, I like you, but you should stop asking questions." I didn't sleep that night. The next day, she sent me a text. "You're great, but this isn't going to work. Take care. I have so many questions, but I never reached out again." Story 15. I once dated a woman who told me she was deeply spiritual. She believed in past lives, reincarnation, and communicating with spirits. I was open-minded, so I didn't mind, until she told me she was my wife in a past life. She claimed we were married in ancient Egypt and that we had unfinished business in this lifetime. I nervously asked what that meant, and she said, "You owe me." Then, she started listing ways I could repay our past life debt. It included buying her gifts, letting her move in, and funding her spiritual retreat to Egypt. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She grabbed my hand, closed her eyes, and started chanting. I pulled away, but she looked me dead in the eyes and whispered, "You can't escape fate." I left and blocked her. A week later, I got a package at my door. A handmade pyramid with my name carved into it. No return address. I moved apartments. Story 16. I once went on a date with a woman who was obsessed with the idea of soulmates. Not in a cute, romantic way. In a scientific way. She said she had cracked the formula for perfect compatibility and that she ran my name, birth date, and photos through her algorithm. She pulled out her phone and showed me a spreadsheet with scores, compatibility charts, and even personality risk factors. I was at a solid 82%, which she said was acceptable but not ideal. She then pulled out a notebook and started asking interview questions. How do you handle stress? Would you describe your relationship with your mother as positive or negative? Are you more of a cat or a dog person? At first, I thought she was just quirky, so I played along. But after 20 minutes, she sighed and shook her head. Your responses brought you down to a 79%. I asked what her ideal score was. She said 95 or higher. Then, with complete seriousness, she asked, "Would you be willing to make some lifestyle adjustments to increase compatibility?" I finished my drink and told her I didn't think we were a match. She sighed again, noted something in her book, and said, "Well, it was worth the experiment. Thanks for participating." I don't know if she ever found her 95%. Story 17. I matched with a woman online who seemed normal, but when we met, she refused to speak. Not in a shy way, she literally wouldn't talk. At first, I thought she had lost her voice or something, but she was smiling, giggling, and texting me responses from across the table. I asked her why she wasn't speaking, and she typed, "I gave up talking for a year to develop my other senses." Okay, weird. I tried to make small talk, but she just stared at me, occasionally nodding. When the waiter asked what she wanted, she handed him a napkin with her order written on it. The strangest part? She kept making direct eye contact without blinking. She would lock onto my eyes for minutes at a time like she was reading my soul. Eventually, I told her, "I don't think this is going to work out." She nodded, grabbed her phone, and typed, "I knew you wouldn't understand." Then she stood up and left without another word. I have never felt more unnerved in my life. Story 18. I went on a first date with a woman who was super into ghosts. I figured, cool, maybe she liked paranormal shows. Nope, she straight up believed she was haunted. She told me a spirit named Daniel had been following her since childhood and that he didn't like when she went on dates. I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Halfway through dinner, she suddenly snapped her head to the side and whispered, "Not now, Daniel." I asked her what was wrong. She sighed and said, "He's mad that we're hitting it off." Then she started talking to the empty chair next to her. She was arguing with it, saying things like, "No, Daniel, I'm allowed to be happy. He's just a friend. Stop being jealous. Please don't break anything this time." At this point, I was done. I asked for the check. She looked at me sadly and said, "I'm sorry, he's just protective." As I was paying, the glass of water on our table tipped over by itself. I don't know if it was condensation, a shaky table, or Daniel, but I never went on another date with her. Story 19. I met a woman at a coffee shop and she seemed super cool. Great conversation, funny, and intelligent. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "If I killed someone, would you help me hide the body?" I laughed, assuming it was a dark joke. She didn't laugh. She stared at me and said, "No, seriously, I need to know." I tried to play along and said, "Depends on the situation, I guess." She leaned in and whispered, "What if it was an accident?" At this point, I was very uncomfortable. She then asked, "What if it wasn't an accident?" I told her I wasn't the right person to ask. She just smiled and said, "Good to know." I excused myself and left. Later that night, I got a text, "I had fun tonight. Don't worry. I was just testing your loyalty." I still wonder if that was a test or a confession. Story 20. I once dated a woman who had a list of punishments. We met online, and at first she was sweet and charming. But early into dating, she introduced me to her system. She pulled out a handwritten notebook filled with rules like, don't ignore texts for more than an hour. Always compliment me at least twice a day. No talking to other women, even coworkers. I asked, "What happens if I break a rule?" She flipped to another page titled Punishments. The list included silent treatment for 24 hours, posting vague, dramatic messages about you online, making you re-earn privileges. I laughed, assuming she was joking. She wasn't. She said, "This keeps relationships balanced." I asked if any guy had ever agreed to this. She nodded and said, "Oh yeah, my ex lasted 3 months before he failed too many times." I left immediately. 2 days later, she texted me, "Since you ghosted me, your punishment is losing me forever." That was the plan. Story 21. I once went on a date with a woman who said she believed in spiritual alignment. I figured she was into astrology or meditation. No big deal. But then she pulled out a pendulum and said she needed to test my energy. Right in the middle of the cafe, she dangled this crystal over my hand and waited for it to move. After a minute of awkward silence, she gasped, "Oh no." I asked what was wrong. She looked genuinely distraught and whispered, "Your aura is tainted." At this point, I was uncomfortable, but I played along and asked what that meant. She sighed dramatically and said, "I think you were a murderer in a past life. Your soul is dark." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She started explaining that I was giving off karmic killer energy, and that I needed a spiritual cleanse before I could be in a relationship. Then she pulled out a bundle of sage and a small bottle of something labeled soul water. I told her I wasn't interested in being cleansed. She shook her head sadly and muttered, "I knew it. You're still in denial." I ended the date as politely as I could, but she texted me later, "I hope you find peace. But please don't come near me again." I never had plans to. Story 22. I met a woman who was fun, attractive, and seemed normal, until she casually mentioned that she had a boyfriend. Confused, I asked why she was on a date with me. She smiled and said, "Oh, he knows. We have a system." Apparently, she was in an open relationship, but with a cat. She was allowed to date and hook up with other people, but her boyfriend had to approve of them first. That's when she pulled out her phone and said, "Say hi." On her screen was a live video call with her boyfriend. He was sitting in a dark room, wearing a hoodie and staring at me without blinking. He nodded once and said, "Yeah, he's all right." I was too stunned to speak. Then she turned back to me and said, "So, do you want to come over?" I politely declined and got out of there. Later, she texted, "He changed his mind. He says you're not a good fit. Sorry." I think I dodged something way worse than a weird relationship. Story 23. I matched with a woman online, and she immediately asked if I had ever been in love. I said yes, and she replied, "Good. That means you know how to commit." A little intense, but whatever. We met up, and within 5 minutes, she started talking about marriage. She told me she already had a wedding dress and had picked out baby names. She said she was looking for someone who wouldn't waste her time, and asked me direct, "Do you see us getting married in the next 2 years?" I awkwardly said I didn't know, and she scoffed. Then, she pulled out a binder. Inside were detailed wedding plans, venue options, catering menus, flower arrangements. She even had engagement ring styles circled. I told her I wasn't ready for marriage planning on a first date. She sighed, put the binder away, and said, "I can tell you're not serious. I'll find someone who is." She left without finishing her drink. 2 days later, I saw her profile on the dating app with a caption that said, "Only looking for husbands. Good luck to whoever signs up for that." Story 24. I once went out with a woman who told me she had a secret, but I had to prove I was trustworthy first. Intrigued, I asked how I could prove it. She handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Take this home. If you don't open it, we'll go on a second date." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but she was completely serious. I took the envelope home and stared at it for hours. What kind of test was this? Was it empty? Did it have something personal inside? Eventually, curiosity got the best of me. I opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper that said, "You failed." I texted her, admitting that I opened it. She replied, "I knew you would. That's why this won't work." I asked what was supposed to happen if I passed. She just said, "Then you would have learned something important about me." I still wonder what was in store for me if I hadn't opened it.